Welcome to Asia Thinker series, organized by Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy and National University of Singapore. This is Alfred Wu, Assistant Dean and Associate Professor at Inequality School. Today's topic is Beyond Vaccines, Asia's Uneven Recovery. In the first part of the seminar, we discussed what lies ahead for Asia in the post-COVID world. In the second part of the seminar, we will invite you, our participants, to be part of this conversation. We put in poll questions which you can give your answer to. At the end of the moderated discussion, we hope to share the result of the poll. Please refer to the chat for instruction on how to put in your poll. We are very fortunate to have three speakers with us in conversation. Dr. Cyn-Young Park is the Director for Regional Cooperation and Integration Division, Economic Research and Regional Cooperation Department at the Asian Development Bank. She will be discussing with us insights on how regional cooperation can help overcome challenges under COVID-19. Cyn-Young, please.
Thank you, Alfred. It's a great pleasure to be here with everyone. So I would like to, next one, please, next slide. So I would like to start looking at where Asian countries stand in the pandemic. After the relatively contained sort of outbreaks in COVID in early this year, new and infectious variant, Delta variant, have emerged and caused another outbreaks across the region. New COVID cases in many Asian countries, especially in ASEAN, peaked around summertime, around 140 cases per million, and then started to decline in August. For the region as a whole, the vaccination has been also making quite a good progress. For now, around 60% of the ASEAN population has been fully vaccinated, and with the rapid accelerated vaccine rollout, the nature of the pandemic is changing rapidly. But we still see uneven progress of the vaccine rollouts across the region, and especially across the different sub-regions in Asia. Next slide, please. Therefore, this has also influenced the uneven recovery in the region. The growth and recovery outlook for Asian economies, especially ASEAN economies, remain positive, driven and supported by the monetary and fiscal policies, and also the relatively good progress in the vaccine rollouts. But the GDP forecast, as you can see, are also diverging across different countries in the region. Developing Asia is now estimated to grow 7.1% in 2021 and 5.4% in 2022. So showing a good positive recovery outlook. Nevertheless, the changes in this nature of the pandemic, as well as uneven progress in vaccinations, are continuing to pose threat to the recovery, and also making the uneven the growth forecast for different countries in the region. Even with our fairly positive growth forecast, risks to the region's recovery outlook remain tilted to the downside. The COVID-19, the different evolution of the risks are now the biggest challenge. Continuing outbreaks may be driven by the new and then more infectious virus variants, slower than expected vaccine rollouts, or also combined with the waning effectiveness of the vaccines. This could hamper economic recovery, and as we have already seen in the past year. At the same time, the policymakers must pay attention to other risks. Geopolitical tensions remain elevated. We continue to experience the disruptions in the global supply chain, which could hinder the recovery in trade and increase trade costs. And normalizing monetary policy in the US and then could also affect the financial markets and then financial conditions in Asia through reversal in the capital flows and then depreciation of the currencies for some emerging market economies in the region. And taking a longer term view, policymakers must refocus on the continued challenges over the medium to long term, such as the debt sustainability, rising inequality, frequent natural hazards, and extreme weather events linked to climate change. Well, for the long-term challenges and risks, in fact, there were some studies about the impact of the past adverse events such as natural disasters or pandemic, epidemics on productivity and then long-term growth potential. Based on the earlier studies of the World Bank, looking at the 4 different episodes of the epidemics on the labor productivity, the study actually anticipated the labor productivity could fall significantly. Some of the factors that explain these labor productivity decline could be the disability from these health events and also the health issues, education outcomes due to closure of schools and changing the human behavior in interactions due to the experience of the pandemic. As a pandemic, this COVID pandemic was even more broadly experienced and affecting the many more populations. The effect that was experienced from the past epidemic could be such an underestimate, and this can lead to much greater the impact on the productivity and then potential growth. For example, major epidemics that occurred since 2000, including the SARS, MERS, Ebola, and Zika, they were more localized events, and they were estimated to have been associated with 6% lower labor productivity in the affected countries after 5 years. The pandemic, with the much greater the geographic spread and then death tolls, these impact could be much greater. Next slide, please. International cooperation remain critical to contain the spread of the disease and then secure recovery. Especially the cooperation is a must on disease control, research, and then production and the distribution and of vaccines and the medical goods. And with reorganization of the global value chain, regional value chain will likely contribute more to economic recovery. Therefore, we need to have greater efforts to strengthen the connectivity, as well as enhance the trade facilitation to maximize the dynamics of the regional value chain to recover from pandemic-induced disruptions in the global supply chain. Regional cooperation is also needed to mobilize finance for more resilient post-pandemic future. We are looking at reconstruction and the recovery, which is not to return to the pre-pandemic. We are expected to reconstruct and recover for a more sustainable and resilient future in East Asia, East and Southeast Asia, which means we will need to mobilize much more productive private capital for sustainable development, and also incorporative of the fight against the climate change. Next slide, please. So these are some areas of priority where enhanced regional cooperation can help. First is the connectivity, logistics, and then trade facilitation. We experienced the significant disruptions in trade supply chain. We need to keep trade flows, especially for critical goods and food, secure supply chains. For second area is the finance and investment flows. We need to ensure financial stability with a stronger regional financial safety net. And thirdly, we start tourism and travel. We have to learn how to reopen borders safely, for example, by creating travel bubbles to kickstart safe and secure tourism. And finally, regional cooperation is a priority for bringing the collective actions to mitigate the negative effects of COVID-19 and also restore the support for regional health, regional health cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you, Cyn-Young. Now, our second speaker, LQS School colleague, is Professor Bert Hofman. He is also the director of East Asian Institute under NUS. Prior to joining us, he has been working with the World Bank for 27 years. He will be speaking about China's outlook and the challenges and discuss the current issues in global supply chains. Bert?
Well, thank you. And thank you, Dr. Park, for this very interesting discussion. And you already mentioned China. I saw the ADB's forecast is at 8.1% growth for this year. And that by and large now seems to be a little bit on the high side, but that's because the report is already a couple of weeks old and things change quite rapidly in China. There's really three things unfolding at the moment. The first is the impact of the slowdown in the real estate sector. And that has little to do with COVID, but it has a lot to do with the policies that were initiated in China last year, in part to address the issue of over-indebtedness. And now we see a cooling down of the real estate sector, which is an important part of the economy. Second, there have been some interruptions domestically in power supply. It hasn't had a very big impact yet, but some regions were affected and some industries were affected during the last quarter. And so the third, excuse me, is really the aftermath of COVID. And we see in China still consumption lagging overall growth. Last year, China was very much on top of the COVID epidemic, and they were the first ones to control it with a really massive effort. And as a consequence, they were the only real big country in the world that grew with 2.3% last year. It was the only one. The world declined with 3.5%, and some countries with a lot more. For this year, the rebound started very strongly, especially export-driven, manufacturing-driven, and investment-driven, but is now sort of teetering because of the issues in the real estate and because consumption hasn't recovered as strongly. One reason for that is that COVID is still around. And China, like other countries, still have to deal with renewed outbreaks, which brings control and which therefore brings, if you want, a slowdown in activities. Second, even though domestic tourism has been much stronger than usual, there's still, if you want, a break on tourism coming from COVID. China has a very high vaccination rate already, and probably after a couple of months more, they can start looking at a more flexible policy on opening up for COVID, as Dr. Park already said. Tremendously important for the region because Chinese tourism is one of the biggest exports of most of the regions at the moment, especially for countries such as Singapore, who rely a lot on not just tourism, but also conferences and the MICE industry, as they call it. So it would be great if China can move on that. Meantime, the relationship of China. So for this year, and look, I'm not a forecaster, but I think I said that we'll probably somewhere end up between 7% and 8% growth. So that's more than Li Keqiang said in March. He said 6% or more is good. But not as much as we first expected for China, where some of the industry forecasts went up to 9%. So we're probably going to end up somewhere between 7 and 8, and then that really depends on the global recovery and also a little bit on the policy outlook in China as it evolves. For the region, the impact of China is that opening up China's border is very important for tourism. But what has happened during COVID is, I think, a very important step, and that is the RCEP. It's going to become effective very soon. There's now sufficient countries that have ratified the agreement, and so we'll have RCEP as a major engine for further regional integration. And frankly, economists are terrible in translating that into growth, so I won't give it a try. But it is, of course, very positive, and it will reinforce the already very strong supply chain relationships within the region. Second, interestingly enough, China has set the ambition even higher. They have applied for the CPTPP, and if you want, that is the gold standard in trade agreements. They have applied, they're not yet a member, and a lot of reforms need to happen for China to be eligible for membership. But that by itself, in my view, signals that China is actually willing to do those reforms. And they include state enterprise reforms, some intellectual property rights reforms, industrial policy reforms, and subsidy policy reforms. And so in the run-up maybe to the 20th Party Congress next year, a very important milestone for China, we could see some of those reforms falling into place. Finally, and I know I'm running out of time, and I may not have time for the supply chains, but finally, an important policy step made in the 14th five-year plan for China is what is now called the dual circulation strategy. And frankly, we still need to see how exactly that works out, but the short end of it is that China wants to rely more on domestic demand. For critical supply chains, it wants to rely more on domestic supply chains. And it wants to rely more on domestic innovation. So 3 planks that will change the structure of China's economy quite fundamentally. As a matter of fact, it has already started to change. China, its exports has been doing well, its import has been doing well, but the nature of those exports and import is changing. Whereas before, say the first 10 years after the entry into the WTO of China, so after 2000 or 2001, you saw that China was the final assembly platform. And so a lot of countries, they sent intermediary goods to China, and there it got assembled. Now, China is increasingly becoming a supplier of those intermediary goods to other countries, to the Vietnams of the world, the Malaysias of the world, the Thailands of the world, and beyond. And so the nature of China's export is changing. It also means that they're increasingly less reliant on markets in the United States. It's still an important market, but it's not the only market anymore, or for Europe for that matter. As a matter of fact, China's trade dependency has come down quite dramatically since the global financial crisis. Before the global financial crisis, China had imports and exports of goods and services was 60% of GDP. Right now it's down to 30. So much less reliance on trade, which in part is very natural. As countries become richer, the domestic economy becomes bigger relative to the external economy, and that's simply a relative price effect. But in addition, of course, there is also the international tensions, and I think to some extent China has chosen this route of dual circulation to if you want, manage the risks that come from possible interruptions of the global supply chain as well. Just 2 words on that global supply chain, because we are looking at the disruption. I just want to say that in a way, it's a good sign. The reason why we have disruption is that trade is doing much better than expected. And a lot of industries are doing much better than expected. Yes, it's still unbalanced, and that has consequences for the distribution systems. But overall, we were surprised by the extent of the recovery of demand, which in part has caused our supply chain, which in part has caused the commodity price spike that we have seen in the global economy as well. I think we've seen the worst. I always, and that shows my age, I guess, but I still look at the Baltic Dry Index as being one index of tensions in global supply chains. It's the price of getting a container from one place to the other, basically. That peaked at 5,500 3 weeks ago. It is now down to 3,500. So it's quite dramatically declining, and it does mean that global supply chains are normalizing. They're not yet normal, but are normalizing to some extent. So I'm hopeful that that will not be the constraint in the global recovery going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Bert. Now, our third speaker is Associate Professor Terence Ho at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. He has been with Singapore Public Service for nearly 20 years, serving in research, policy, and leadership roles across different government departments. He will share insight on the impact of Delta variant and how countries may make the transition to living with COVID-19. Terence?
Yeah.
Please.
Thank you very much, Alfred. I'm very glad to be here, and thanks to the previous 2 speakers as well for excellent presentations. So in the brief time we have, I just want to touch on a few points. I think some of them have been covered to some degree in the previous presentations as well, so just quite briefly. First of all, I think when we talk about trying to project growth or recovery, it's very difficult because inherently the virus of the infection is really setting the pace with new variants and strains, much as we try our best and governments try their best to respond to them. Secondly, I think the resurgence of inflation in many parts of the world, including in Asia, is going to complicate some of the recovery efforts and also constrain maybe the policy space that governments have. In terms of medium-term consequences, we're already seeing that inequality, especially wealth inequality, may be a growing concern. And there's a need to strengthen both economic and social resilience, but at the same time, a lot of fiscal expenditure has already been spent and resources are constrained. Yeah, so the impact of Delta variant, I think from the middle of the year, this has become the dominant strain. It has definitely put the dent in recovery. I think the ADB's forecast for developing Asia growth rate is shaded down somewhat from the April forecast. But as Bert pointed out, global demand has and even trade has held up quite well. So not too bad a downgrade, but still a downgrade nonetheless. And many have also pointed out that the goal of eliminating poverty, which has made great progress over the past few decades, absolute poverty in Asia has been set back. According to a World Bank report in March, poverty in East Asia and the Pacific stopped declining for the first time in decades last year. So this is going to be a challenge. And countries are at different stages of dealing with COVID and also have had different strategies. But it looks increasingly difficult to maintain COVID-0 type strategies as many countries are finding with the more transmissible Delta variant. So just a quick look at some of the data in terms of the infections, comparing the world with Asia. While Asia has largely escaped perhaps the first wave in terms of the intensity, it seems to be tracking the global trend for the second and third wave quite closely. For deaths per million people, again, Asia has been tracking the rest of the world in terms of the second and third wave, but fortunately with the rollout of vaccinations, we can see that with successive waves, the death rate peaks have been trending downwards, and we hope that will continue. And if we look at what makes up the Asian peaks, we saw a very first large peak in India, one of the larger economies, and subsequently in some of the other larger economies in Asia, where there's Indonesia, Japan, Philippines, and now Central Asia. They're contributing to the second Asian peak, if you like. In terms of vaccinations, while Asia has been doing well in terms of leading the world slightly overall, we find a huge disparity has been pointed out by, I think, Dr. Park, in terms of the, different countries' vaccination rates. So for the richer economies, they've had quite a good success in getting the vaccination rate up. But for the lower to middle income economies, there's still quite some distance to go. And that's also contributing to the disparity in growth and recovery across Asia. Yeah, so what would be some of the main factors that would affect or influence Asia's recovery? As mentioned, the uncertainty from new strains, whether it's Delta Plus or new variants that may be emerging. And in this interconnected world, of course, how the rest of the world fares will definitely impinge much on Asia. And Europe right now is also experiencing a resurgence of cases as many of the safe distancing measures have been relaxed. A pace of vaccination, of course, and the rollout of booster, now that the efficacy of the initial round of vaccination may be waning. At the same time, we're grappling with many other driving forces from geopolitical tensions, trade rivalry, and in the immediate to medium term, the structural adaptation to climate change, the full cost has yet to be factored in. By one estimate, the world needs around $5 trillion a year by 2030 to fight climate change, according to the World Resources Institute. So this is going to be a major adjustment that many governments will have to deal with. And then, of course, now with the disrupted supply chains. And the trade-off between lives and livelihoods is going to be sharper as countries and economies open up, and pivoting from maybe a zero COVID strategy to learning to live with endemic COVID. And certainly this has been the experience in Singapore and other economies as well. As mentioned, inflation is a growing concern. First of all, in 2020, the huge fiscal and monetary stimulus sent asset prices skyrocketing, whether it's in property or equities in many parts of the world and Asia. And this has been fueling wealth inequality. And now we're experiencing general price inflation with the recovery in demand. At the same time, with supply disruptions ranging from factory closures to people being unable to go back to work, to electricity, blackouts, and we have ships stuck in ports. And so the prices of freight from semiconductor chips, energy have all shot up, and in turn fueling the rising cost of finished goods as well. So this, of course, poses a dilemma. Is the spike in inflation transient, as initially perhaps believed by the US Federal Reserve? And monetary policy tightening to combat inflation could, of course, derail the strength of the recovery. But at the same time, keeping still could entrench inflationary expectations, maybe lead to wage price spirals, and may necessitate further tightening down the road. And some have also talked about the risks of stagflation, which is a weak economy plus strong inflation. So as mentioned, the inequality has widened both across countries as well as within countries, with a differential speed of vaccination and resources to cope with the crisis across countries. And within countries, of course, the uneven economic impact across sectors and occupations. And many countries have found that lower income workers have suffered disproportionate job income losses due to the nature of their work. And so we have wealth inequality combined with income inequality, and some have described this as a K-shaped recovery, meaning the widening disparities. And in terms of the impact as well in the medium to longer term, the increased use of home-based learning may disadvantage some lower-income children whose households have fewer resources and maybe slower internet speeds and so on to keep up. So this is just a graph to show that, to illustrate the rise in equity prices in the major Asian stock indices last year and continuing into this year as well. Many countries, according to the ILO, have stepped up social protection, and this is some of the most common social protections that have been put in place. But at the same time, can this be sustained? This is a question that we need to think about as the crisis drags on, with the end perhaps not quite yet in sight. Fiscal deficits have grown, and tighter monetary conditions may constrain recovery and make debt servicing more expensive. Yeah, so that brings me to the end of this brief sharing. Thank you.
Thank you, Terence. Terence actually just published a new book on social economic policy for the 21st century. Now we come to the moderated discussion section. Before we begin, a very quick reminder to the audience, please give us your vote for the poll, because we want you to be a part of this conversation. Please follow the chat message for instructions on how to submit your poll. Based on what the speakers have shared, let's first talk about Asia's uneven recovery. Although COVID cases are still rising around the world, Cyn-Young, can I have you respond to the question is whether developing Asia will continue to drive a global growth in the post-COVID periods? Because based on ADB report, before COVID, developing Asia contributed 60% of global growth. Cyn-Young, please.
Well, thank you, Alfred. Despite seemingly slow vaccination and some delays in full recovery, Asia still holds the greatest promise in the path that return to the normal growth. So in our region, again, as the Bert already mentioned a few times, that China did have much faster sort of vaccination early on, and then it actually drove the recovery in exports early, even as early as summertime of the last year. And regional economies are strengthening the value chain network with the China as a hub. There was a great increase in intensify the regional value chain over the past at least about 2 decades that we have been following up. And thanks to this, Asia, with China leading the export growth, have demonstrated strong increase in exports since the second half of last year. The export-driven growth is continuing, especially in the pent-up demand associated with the global recovery is expected to increase the global demand as the recovery broadens around the global economy. So Asia still presents the brightest spot in the global recovery, and we believe that the recovery and then growth prospect for Asian economies remain brighter than other developing regions.
Thank you. Ling, the question to Bert, you bring a lot of good news about China and also challenges about China. But we want to particularly ask you, what are some of the risks for China's economic growth? You could see that.
Well, so I think I've already reviewed two. The one is the continued presence of COVID and China's policies. The second is the real estate sector. I think in the medium term, what is on a lot of investors' mind, and a lot of it, mind you, a lot of it is changing. And as we speak, we have the sixth plenum ongoing, the sixth plenum of the Communist Party of China, which is potentially a watershed. So there seems to be a different direction that has been taken on the policy level of China, and it has to do with the balance of state and market and China's approach to market regulation. In the short term, that can be disruptive because investors don't quite understand yet what is happening, and they may hold back. It's one reason why a number of forecasters to put down the expectations on investment. And in the medium term, we have to think about, well, what does it mean for productivity, for investment, for innovation? Of course, if you look at the regulations, and I looked at them in quite a bit of detail, a lot of them are actually quite right. And some countries might be jealous of what China is doing because they are trying to manage monopoly elements in internet business. They are trying to manage some of the excesses that happened in terms of the marketization of really public services such as education and health. And and the data privacy issue is a third regulation that just got into place in November. And by and large, these are good regulations, but at the same time, they also bring uncertainty for investors and for entrepreneurs to see what is still possible and where can I still make money. And the fact of the matter is that once you have, as China has, reached upper middle income or almost high income status, $11,000 per capita, the way to continue to grow is that you have a lot of entrepreneurs that want to be rich and that are driving for this productivity increases, that are driving for new ideas and new applications. So with some policy shifts, there may be some uncertainty in the system, and the question is how is that going to work out in growth rate? In the medium term, I think that China will slow down. There's no question about it. The days of double-digit growth are well over. But the question is, what is potential growth for China? Most of the estimates end up for the next 10, 15 years between 4.5 and 5. And if so, one would still see a doubling of China's economy by 2035. And that's something that would be welcomed by Xi Jinping, who said that would be possible.
Yeah, thank you, Bert. I'm quite impressed by Terence sharing, particularly on the inequality at a very macro level and a micro level. Can I just ask, Terence, based on your book project and also your current sharing about the impact of COVID, could you do more like sharing about like social policy and economic growth?
Sure. Yeah, actually, just to clarify, my book focuses on Singapore's experience, but I think many of the challenges that I face are quite common. So in particular, in Singapore, we don't really have unemployment insurance as yet, or protection for people who have fallen into unemployment for the general workforce. So during the COVID period, the government had to put in place special provisions, both to encourage firms to hold on to the workers, as well as to provide support, transitory or temporary support for those who've lost their jobs. So I think in Singapore, as well as other countries, as the COVID crisis drags on, one of the questions is really whether some of these things need to be sustained for longer or even made permanent or semi-permanent, some of these measures. And the key question is really, are there enough resources to do so? And also, how does that fit in terms of the overall social protection framework, whether the right incentives still to look for work and to be gainfully employed will still be there. So these are things that that I think the COVID crisis has really made governments having to reflect on some of these issues right now.
Thank you a lot. We have a lot of reflections, particularly under COVID-19, I mean, on every level. So now we move to the next section is poll questions. So you could see the first question is how do you think global and regional trade will evolve in post-COVID period. Majority of people are quite optimistic. They talk about we will have to continue globalization and trade growth. Very few people talk about deglobalization. But in social policy debate, now a lot of people talk about deglobalization and also anti-immigration issues. Very interesting finding. Then can we go to second question? Second question talk about what risk to the outlook are you most worried about? So people are quite concerned about climate crisis. Then after that, they are worried about continual COVID outbreaks. It sounds quite reasonable. Some people worry about China's property sectors and a global energy shortage. Now maybe we come to the final section, is a Q&A section. I would like to read out the first question. The first question is about what are the best and the worst possible scenarios moving into 2020, focus on COVID cases and economy. What are the bright spots? I think all of us are curious about that.
Okay, well, I think the first worst scenario is more or less obvious, right? Like if we get the again the resurgent COVID cases, and then vaccine effectiveness is not as strong as we expected, we somehow retreat back into our the experience of a lockdown. This is going to be our worst case scenario, I guess. But for the brightest spot, I would also like to point out that the COVID-19 has also presented quite a substantial the digital opportunities. There are like it or not, like many of us experience extreme shift from offline to online social and then economic activities over the past 2 years. So many businesses have shifted their modes of doing business, also serving their clients from online to offline to online, and like it or not, we were sort of forced to maintain some kind of normality in socio-economic activities online. So this unlikely to return to post-COVID level. There's the really great potential of the new business opportunities and the new ways of creating economic value from the digital platform enabled businesses. So in order to really tap the new potential of the digital economy, that we need to make a much more investment. First of all, like invest in digital connectivity and invest in the digital infrastructure. And secondly, we need to educate people. We have to invest in the human capital, in strengthen the digital skills, and also promote the the digital literacy, and then also the digital awareness of general public. And we have to prepare the laws and regulations, and also all the institutional framework to support digital ecosystem. So a lot of these the business ecosystem have to be reviewed and also re-engineered to provide the support for digital businesses to thrive. So these are the three areas that we should really focus to be able to maximize the potential gains coming from the digital economy.
Can Bert also respond to this question?
All right, look, I don't know whether worst or best, but following up on the questions, I'm a bit more worried than the general audience here on the adjustment of monetary policy. The reason being is that debt levels are quite high around the world, and they have been high for quite some time. And monetary policy will have to adjust at some point. We said that after the global financial crisis, it didn't really happen, and that we only very, very gradually so. But there's downsides to not adjusting as well, and that is really lies in the sphere of productivity and innovation, where that has been very lackluster over the past decade and a half in all countries around the world, not just China, all countries around the world, in part because we have a lot of zombie firms, as they say. So I think at some point you will see that adjustment, and how that can trickle through the global economy, frankly, is pretty hard to assess. And I would like to remind the audience that maybe not everybody has noticed, but in March 2020, we almost had a new global financial crisis, and due to a very unexpected outcome of an incredible demand for liquidity, where even the U.S. Treasury market, the deepest market in the world, started to wobble, and the Fed had to step in a major way to stabilize it. So I think these financial issues, one should not forget about it. I like the emphasis on climate change, because there's a short-term effect as well as a longer-term effect. And the short-term effect, I think we now are much more aware of potential disruptions of global value chains. Reshoring and deglobalization is not the solution. As a matter of fact, the evidence, the World Bank looked into the evidence as it stands thus far. Countries that were better integrated into global supply chains did better during the COVID crisis, simply because they had more alternatives to either buy or sell their goods. But there is this issue of resilience. And I think where climate change and global supply chains interact is this resilience. So I think there will be some reorganization of global supply chains to make them more resilient. That does not mean deglobalization, but it does mean that you have an additional factor, not just efficiency considerations, but also resilience considerations that will shape the future. I don't think that is not a crisis material, or that has a worse outcome, but I do hope that people, that policymakers around the world take care of that on the climate change as well as on the resilience. A final note that I think might come out as a bad outcome, might come out of the COVID crisis, is that countries have been under a lot of stress, and some countries have managed that better than others, I have to say. My own country, or I would say I can speak maybe for Europe, a lot of internal tensions came up, and they were not managed very well on the political front. The United States, we know very well, up front and center, and Asia has done relatively well. But those internal tensions, they might lead to a backlash internationally. And the United States has already been clear. Other countries might think as well, that deglobalization might become an outcome of political forces that play domestically around the world. I don't think that's a likely outcome yet, but those forces are there and need to be managed by politicians around the world. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Bert, for your sharing. In Singapore context, we also talk a lot about resilient state in post-COVID period. Can Terence share your thoughts?
Yeah, I think Singapore, like many other countries, we have to look at resilience from many different angles. Certainly from the healthcare angle, how do we prepare for future crisis, whether it's another variant of COVID or future disease X, make sure our healthcare systems and all that are resilient. In terms of supply chain, certainly as well, I'm quite glad to see that the most people in the poll felt that globalization still has momentum. And indeed, I think we are not going to go back to a state of autarky, but really countries having to reorder the supply chains for greater resilience, as what Bert has pointed out. And I also like this point about how the greening of supply chains will have to integrate climate considerations, and that will require transparency, traceability, and that also feeds into something that Cyn-Young mentioned about digitization and how digitization can also help with transparency and traceability, and how we can promote that not just within countries, but regionally, whether it's from digital economy agreements, and how we can have greater cooperation in that area as well.
I would like to start from Terence. I want to ask a question for all speakers. What are your thoughts on the role of technology and the digital solution in enhancing Asia's potential recovery rate?
Well, certainly, as we have been discussing, digitalization and digital solutions will have a very large role to play. There was a report, I think, by Google, Temasek, and Bain released last November that found that as many as 40 million people in just 6 Southeast Asian countries came online for the first time last year. And this raised the number of internet users to nearly 70% of the population in these 6 economies. So just an illustration of now with increased digitalization, there's also the opportunity to deploy more tools that would help, whether it's in pandemic management or many other areas. But as what Cyn-Young pointed out, then digital literacy and so on comes into play to make sure that we can fully maximize the opportunities. But as you all know as well, with increased use of digitalization comes a number of risks as well. So these have to be dealt with by governments as well as regionally and globally.
Thank you. So can Bert also respond to this question?
Well, I mean, Terence said most of it. I mean, we're discovering all kinds of new ways of doing business, and this Zoom is very much an example of it. Normally, we would have been at the Lee Kuan Yew School with 50 people in the room, and now we can do this online. Frankly, and I can do 7 conferences a week rather than 1 or 2. So at least for researchers and people that are already in if you want, their business is connectivity with others. Technology, of course, is a boon. We shouldn't forget, though, that there is still a very big digital divide, and that's an opportunity as well. So investing in access to digital technologies is still, for many countries in the region, a really good destination for investment. I take the example of China, which was earlier. But part of the reason why e-commerce took off so much, why fintech took off so much, was because the government invested very heavily in connectivity. This might be a great moment for other countries to do so as well. The second, and I come back to the climate change issue, given that demand support from governments, in my view, will continue to be necessary for a number of years until we finally exit fully the crisis. And mind you, some countries already have almost, but many countries are still only at vaccination rates where it still affects the economy. So this is a great time to accelerate the greening of the economy, to accelerate investment in renewables, to accelerate investments in smart grids that will pay off for decades to come. So it will boost demand in the short term, and will help people get jobs, but it will also make for a much more sustainable future. So that, if you want, that's a technology whose time has come.
Sia?
I thought I already mentioned quite a few. Again, I think already Terence and then Bert mentioned digital technology and how to use them really efficiently and then judiciously will unlock great potential for productivity and then also the growth potential for many countries in the region. I can't agree more on the importance of narrowing the digital divide to make sure that the digital technology and then the transformation into the digital economy is going to be as inclusive as possible. We need to make sure that in a way the kind of like the social protections and also a lot of the redistributed the policies that have to be I think the reformed and then changed to focus more on the like a more exposed to ex ante. So we have to focus on the rather than after the gains and then trying to redistribute, we have to really think our mindset a little differently and trying to make sure that how we can involve as many people as in the digital transformation and being able to join the digital economy prior to having these businesses producing some the gains by increasing the digital literacy, investing in the human capital, increasing the digital skills, and being able to create a new sort of the way of participating in the economy through the digital labor platforms as well.
Our audience are very concerned about global inflation developing along economic recovery. I mean, speaker all talk about this issue in the past, but in the meantime, they also want to ask how government could tackle this issue, inflation and also economic recovery. So maybe start from Senior.
I am actually a bit concerned about the recent increase in the global inflation. Inflation. Although I have heard a lot of forecasts in recent months, ranging from our own ADO to IMF and the World Bank. All of them seem to suggest that the inflation is transitory and driven partly by the transient supply factors, especially driven by the increase in the food and then the oil prices. But personally, I do feel that this has a bit more than transient drivers. The supply chain disruptions are unlikely to go away right away. So there are these kind of continued downside risks to the inflation uptick. At the same time, there's also risks to the inflation from demand side as well. As I mentioned, that the recovery broadens this into the next year. The pent-up demand will likely also push up inflation. So inflation is a bit underestimated as of now by the many of the forecasters, I believe. But having said that, inflation becomes more of an issue because if the inflation increases faster, and then many countries now also start to see that it goes outside the target range of the many of the monetary authorities. That means it could trigger a return to the monetary policy normalization faster in the US and some of the regional economies. That I actually couldn't agree more with Bert before, that we almost had financial crisis last year around the springtime, and this is with the U.S. monetary policy, return to the normalization a bit faster than expected. The experience of taper tantrum in 2013 can return to the region as well. Fundamentally, the region's economies are relying too heavily on U.S. dollar. for all international transactions, either on trade or financial. And then there's a greater like concentration in the global banking network, which also heavily surrounding the the USD transactions. So if the dollar goes up, that the global liquidity conditions tighten, this will inevitably spill over to the developing region, especially in Asia. So my concern is that the risks to the financial risks to the global inflation and the financial stability have to be a bit more. I think it has to be a bit more seriously taken than currently being somehow thought.
Thanks, Cyn-Young, for your sharing. I mean, inflation is a real concern. Like from my family members' experience with grocery shopping, inflation is with ordinary people now. So may I invite Bert for your thought?
No, I won't say much. Just two things. I mean, even though I think it's a significant risk, I think we're still on the good side of that risk, and that's in part because globally, central banks still have the credibility to manage expectations of people on inflation. But more broadly, inflation is a risk, especially for the poor. So it's not something to be taken lightly, and it is a risk if it gets ingrained into people's minds, and so they start making wage demands based on expected inflation. That's the world I knew in the 70s and the early 80s, and that's the world that I studied. And it took 30 years for central banks to get away from those expectations, and it was quite painful, frankly. So it is important to watch it. But countries such as China and others here in the region, but also in Europe, they have a history of high inflation, and that history was a very painful inflation. So I think there is also sufficient mindset to keep an eye on that. Structurally, I think we still have a problem in demand rather than in supply, i.e. the secular stagnation with an aging of societies will mean that we, in Asia as well as elsewhere, will mean that demand will be weaker as we go ahead. Thanks.
Terence, you just share a lot about inflation and also inequality. Would you like to add more?
Yeah, so I always think that there are two aspects to look at. One is the wealth inequality really related to asset prices. And the other, of course, is the general price inflation. I think there was also a question in the chat on whether governments may need other tools like wealth taxes to combat some of the growing wealth inequality. And indeed, this is something that I think many governments, including Singapore, are studying to see what options there may be available to keep that in check. Because I think rising property prices and all that also have other social consequences. And there's a need for governments to address these as well for inclusive society.
Now we come to the final question. It's a very juicy question. It's China's property tax actually stir a lot of debate around the world. So anybody would like to share your thoughts?
Well, I'm not familiar with the Chinese property tax, but having since the introduction of the wealth tax and then also the property tax in Korea, I think the Korea has probably the most significant wealth and the property tax in Asia, if not in the world. There's definitely as an economist, I do feel that there's a lot of also the downside or side effects of the wealth tax and then property tax. nevertheless, we are going into a new era when this wealth and then income inequalities are much more difficult to to leave it for the market to rectify. So some of the ways to redistribute or even pre-distribute the wealth and then the income through some of the taxes or transfers need to be carefully considered. So wealth or property tax might be some options or considerations that the governments can look at it much more carefully. I would still caution against having like maybe a one size fits all or like some kind of uniform wealth or property tax for all countries. Because every country is very different, every economic situation is very different. So it has to be very carefully designed and then discussed within each specific country condition. And more importantly, it requires a greater political will plus consensus building. If not supported by the good consensus, ill design the wealth or property tax can cause more harm than bring the benefits, I believe.
All right, let me say a few words. And my first report on China back in 1993 has the line that a property tax would be a really good idea for China, but that was 1993. Now we're in 2021. The complexity in China is that a lot of people have bought their houses already in the expectation that they don't pay tax and therefore pay a lot for their housing. Now to come back and say, well, oh, actually, no, you have to pay that tax. That's a distributional issue that's difficult. At the same time, giving new entrants a chance at lower prices might be helpful in terms of redistributive policies. So one could imagine, and that's not an unimaginable idea for China, is to say, well, from now on, for new houses, we will tax. And it simply means that you get a redistribution between the tax price and the price you pay. So you pay a flow of taxes over the years, and that lowers your acquisition price of your property today. That might be, I think, a very reasonable way of going about it, to phase in, if you want, the property tax. The leases of the past, they're running out. So previously people bought leases for 20 years, 30 years, and then it became 70 years, but still they run out at some point. Up until now, China has extended those leases without questions asked for free. They could consider using the renewal of those leases to introduce a property tax at that point. One of the big problems is that a lot of people that have not much income, they live in $1 million properties. So even if you charge only 0.5%, for most pensioners who live in $1 million house, it would be too much. And that would be socially very disruptive. Economists say, sure, then they need to go live somewhere else. But socially, that's of course very disruptive. So there are complexities in China. I think in the end, there will be a version of the property tax, but it will not solve all the wealth problem. Because frankly, if you look at countries around the world, only the United States comes to 2% of GDP in taxes and property taxes. Most are between 1.5 and 1.5% of GDP in OECD countries. Is not going to change the world. So China would have to look at other means, especially the personal income tax, which is still very, very minimal, and potentially capital gains tax. Wealth taxes as such are not very popular, hard to implement. The only wealth tax in the world that works reasonably well are inheritance taxes. And again, the United States is probably the one that generates most. The UK also generates quite a bit of inheritance taxes. My own country, only 0.5% of GDP. A capital gains tax would fit that bill, where you say, well, during COVID, there was all this loose monetary policy which drove up asset prices. Well, with a capital gains tax, you would at some point have to pay over taxes over those capital gains. That seems reasonable, and it won't break the bank because you can put a tax at the point of sales, not in a recurrent wealth taxation, which is simply hard. Thanks.
Thank you, Bert. A lot of Chinese friends actually asked me about property tax in Singapore and whether Singapore experience can offer some sort of policy implication for China and also other developing world. So Terence, would you like to offer some your journey?
Yeah, so in Singapore, we don't have many other types of wealth tax like capital gains and so on. We also no longer have the estate duty. So the principal wealth tax has really been on property, which has always been an asset class quite popular among Singaporeans. And some years ago, steps were also taken to make it more progressive in terms of people owning second properties, multiple properties, and so on. The question is there scope to do even more in this regard? Some would say that yes, there is perhaps room to increase the progressivity further. But I think the government in Singapore is still keeping options open as to what may be appropriate forms of wealth taxation. So I think whether this can be transplanted to other countries, I think maybe some of the difficulties were alluded to by Bert, that in China, if people bought the properties without factoring in that, property taxes that might require some kind of transition, or maybe applying only to new property and so on.
Thank you all. At QI school, we always have one called elevator question. So it means you actually summarize your main finding within 1 minute. So can we start from Sia?
Well, I think the COVID really presented unprecedented challenges for many Asian economies. There's definitely, biggest challenge that I see is widening inequality. COVID unfortunately hit hard and vulnerable more hard, we should really think of the kind of like a long-term the productivity issues, and then how to ensure that this uneven impact of the COVID, especially going into the long-term impact, more manageable for the poor and the vulnerable. So the discussions of the digital transformation, I think also the many of the policy sort of side effects in a way, the asset price bubbles and the inflation tend to hit the poor and the vulnerable more. So the policy support should be much more geared toward providing the needed support for these people, and not being in the kind of falling back to the poverty trap, or somehow this the increased inequality have a long duration impact on their chances of moving up.
Cyn-Young, probably you mute yourself.
No, she stopped.
Yes.
I stopped. Yes, I'm done.
Yeah. Okay.
Shall I go next?
Yes, please.
All right. Well, I'll keep it very brief. Look, from all I've seen coming out of COVID, it takes more rather than less international cooperation to solve the global issues, such as COVID, such as international trade, such as debt issues, and of course the big issue, climate change. And I hope that despite the domestic tensions, I hope that countries will achieve that cooperation and continue to further integrate. It might be more regionally, and I think, as a fact, I think Asia will be the leading region in further integration and become increasingly an example for others. Thanks.
Thank you. Terence.
Yeah, I think to summarize, I see the challenges really as being how we can have more sustainability, more resilient, and more inclusive in regard to the whether it's the climate, the economy, and society. So to meet these challenges, really, it's about governance quality within countries and economies, and also, of course, the regional and multilateral cooperation. So these remain the main challenges.
It looks like all speakers really like globalization and also cooperation between countries. Then finally, some audience actually talk about signal disruptions in this seminar. Apologies. That's also one reason why all speakers discuss digital solutions. But for myself, I'm much more concerned about digital infrastructure, in particular in developing countries, instead of very much developed countries. So we are now come to the end of this Asia Thinker series. On behalf of the school, we want to thank Dr. Cyn-Young Park from ADB and Professor Bert Hofman and Terence Ho for your contributions to Asia Thinker series. We wish all participants a very good evening ahead. Thank you for your participation and great input today. Please do watch the school website for the second installment of Asia Thinker series, Beyond Vaccines. Then next one, we will tackle sustainable issue in Asia. Thank you again, and have a very good night ahead. Thank you.